Poetry can be a boundless form of art that expresses the beauty of the world and the joy of life to contemplations on death and grief and everything in between. Our guest on today's Touch Basin's Hole is a Korean-British poet who's been exploring such ideas in her recently published debut book, dedicated to her late father. It's called Aftereffects, and I'm delighted to say that Ms. Jiye has joined us in the studio to tell us more about it and her story. Ms. E, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you first introduce yourself to our listeners today? Who are you and where have you come from?
Yeah. So I'm a British Korean writer and poet from the north of England, from a city called Newcastle. And I spent the majority of my life in the UK, though I have kind of lived here and there, including like Malaysia and South Korea in my my adulthood. So, yeah.
And you've said you're a writer and a poet. How long have you been writing for?
I guess since 2015. So I think that was when I was just writing as a hobby. And then later on it became more and more serious. So I guess I've been seriously writing for, it's not been that too long, it's about 3 years, I would say.
Okay, and when you started writing, what stage of that in your life was it? Were you still a student, or were you working, or what was that?
Yeah, actually I was working in South Korea at the time. I was teaching English and literature and creative writing to students in Korea. And that was my first time working and living in Korea. And obviously there was a lot of culture shock, and there were just like lots of things that I didn't really understand about Korean society, and I kind of like vented through my writing. But that kind of it kind of started, becoming more than just like little rants. It started to go more deeper into different things and different topics, and exploring, my students' lives or parts of Korean society and stuff like that.
And when did you realise that was what you wanted to do more of, pursue it as more than just a hobby?
I think as I was teaching poetry and writing to my Korean students, they enjoyed it so much, and like we enjoyed it together, and that made me feel like I want to know more about this art form. I want to be more of an expert in this field. And that kind of like increased the desire.
And it's culminated in this book of poems, Aftereffects, just released on March 19th. Can you introduce us to this work?
Yeah, so this collection is a series of poems that document a journey of personal grief, especially regarding the loss of my father in my early 20s. But it also deals with other forms of losses too, like losing one's country through war, or societal losses, cultural losses. And it covers other themes like relationships and breakups and catastrophe, mental health struggles, all of that.
When you started writing the poems for this book, did you always know that it was going to be published into a book? Was that your aim?
No. The poems began, so I just lost my father, and I guess writing was my only space in which I could journal the bewilderment and the anguish, and it kind of started as journal entries. And then later on, when I looked back at them, I realised they were kind of accidental poetry. So later I did a master's in writing, and I went back to those poems, and I added more meat and shaped them and learned more about the craft. And so it wasn't intentional. It was just more like pouring out my emotions during a hard time.
Okay, and then did you get approached to do the book, or was it something that you wanted to put out there?
Well, I had these poems, I had this collection that I felt could speak to other people who had gone through a difficult loss. And so I tried to polish up the poems, and I saw I saw a few like presses, but it was only one that caught my attention. It was based in Manchester, and they are an independent press, and they just seemed a bit different to like the other presses. They were a publishing company that were a bit more socially and politically conscious. They had much more diversity with their writers, and the topics as well. And I liked the sound of that publishing company. So they had a manuscript submission going on, so I sent my work in. Obviously, I had no idea like I would get an offer for a publication contract, but that's how it started. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Now that it is in physical form, you have this book. What was it like when you first saw it and you held it in your hand?
So, because of Corona, it hasn't actually been shipped to me yet. Yeah.
Right, okay.
There's been a delay in the shipping.
Okay, so you know it's out there.
I know it's out there.
Held it in your hand
People
yet.
have,
okay.
yeah. They've sent me photos of it. They've held it in their hands. And, yeah.
Sure. What's the reaction been like so far?
Really positive and really encouraging. I think I was a bit nervous to have such personal poetry like go out into the world, and especially like even with my closest friends, they had no idea that I had written all of these things, and then they were like, they saw these poems, and you know, I was surprised that there were many other people, like just different age ranges as well, just responding in such a warm and positive way.
And what about your family as well? How have they reacted to the book? Because this work must touch them personally as well.
Well, I think that's kind of one of the issues of language that plays in here. My mother can't understand my poems because they're in English. So she can only see people's responses. She doesn't actually really know the content of the poems. But, I mean, from the people's responses, she's happy. But she's also very curious as to know what they are.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a shame, but I'm sure she's still very proud of what you've achieved. You talk about, your family is Korean. How does that identity of being British Korean play into your work? Because I understand you've referenced Korea and your heritage in them.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I focus on intentionally that aspect in my works, but because it's such an intrinsic part of me, it just, I guess it inevitably seeps into my works, and often I'm unaware of it, and I write something and it like shows up in my writing. But I think growing up with those two languages and those two cultures, there was always English and Korean like in conflict with each other, and I think that struggle is what like made writing more appealing to me, and why I think it's so important. Because when I'm writing, I have like full control of the language. I know what I want to say. There's no room for like miscommunication or misunderstanding. And growing up, it wasn't just cultural or generational differences. There was this issue of language being a barrier to communication between my parents and I.
It's interesting as well because I'm Korean British as well myself, and when I read some of your juxtapositions of your Korean heritage versus things which are very British, for example, referencing Primark and Northumberland Street,
Yeah.
things like that, it brings it all back and hits home for me personally. What do you wish your readers of your poems to experience and feel?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there is a universal feeling that I want everyone to feel, because poetry is subjective, but I think each of my poems are working to achieve a different response. So with Aftereffects, with this collection, I really just wanted people to feel like life is worth living, and especially in this time of public mourning and with, I would say, the siege of COVID-19 and the amount of loss, I just want people to kind of seek and find that hope in this time of like darkness right now.
Sure, it sounds like a very powerful work, and I hope you can get your physical copy of it soon. Finally, what's next for you? We learned that you have an upcoming audio poem on BBC Sounds. Can you tell us about that project or any other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so I actually have two projects with BBC, but the first one is, they're both audio poems, and the first one is, it's narrative poetry that interweaves one of Sam Smith's songs, and so it was quite experimental for me. I can't say too much about the release date, as things are being a bit held up due to Corona.
Sure.
But the other project, which has been more recent, is, again, it's an audio poem, and that talks about like the act of hairbrushing and the nature of relationships between mothers and daughters and through different stages of life, and that will air on BBC Radio Newcastle and also go up on BBC Sounds. Yeah.
That sounds great. So, thank you for sharing your story with us today. We've been speaking to poet Jiye about her debut book, Aftereffects, which is out now. Mizzy, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to more of your fascinating and powerful works.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.